In this video, we'll be talking about data types in Google Data Studio, and we'll make sure that by the end of this lesson, we understand the difference between them. Because without understanding this, I can assure you that we'll get frustrated as soon as we start building a report. So let's not wait further and let's talk about field types. As we've seen before, when you connect to your data in Data Studio, you're presented with a list of fields along with their default properties as shown here. So you have various data types. You have dimensions that appear as green fields. Metrics appear as blue fields. Calculated fields appear either as green or blue fields, and there's an FX tag that appears next to the field name, and it indicates that it is a calculated field. And finally, you also have parameters that appear as purple fields. So every field has the following properties: a name, a data type. So for example, the data type could be a number, a text, or a date range. And the data type is important because it determines how the data appears in your report, which operations are allowed for it and which are not. For example, if you have a text field, obviously you won't be able to apply an arithmetic function to it. Next, every field also has a default aggregation property. So the aggregation is the method by which a field's data is summarized. So for example, if I had a data set containing a list with the numbers from 1 to 10, and my aggregation method is a sum, then whenever you ask a chart to summarize the data, then you get the sum of the numbers in the list, so 55. If my aggregation method was set to average, then whenever we ask for the data summary, then we'll get the average of all of my numbers, so it would be 5.5, right? And if my aggregation was set to max, then obviously the data summary will return 10 and the min would return 0. Oh, actually 1. So the last property, so those are the aggregation method. And so the last property that every field has is the description property. This is just some metadata that you can attach to your field. It's not really important for us, but at least we know that it's there. So now let's go back to our field types. So the first one, dimensions. What are they? Well, they basically describe or categorize your data. So for example, in our Google Sheet example, the dimensions would have corresponded to our column headers. So date, apples, oranges, and peach. So we can check that and open our data source. Let's head back into our first report, click on the table and edit the data source. And indeed, we can see that we have the column headers here in the dimensions. What about metrics? Well, the metric measures your dimensions. So basically, it is the result of applying an aggregation to a set of values. So if we take a look at our Google Sheet example again, the metrics are the values under the column titles. So this here would be my metric for apples. This would be my metric for oranges. This would be my metric for peach. So if we take a look at the data source again, we scroll down a bit, and we don't see any metrics named apples. However, we'll be able to use the apples dimension and specify that we want it to be a metric, in which case it would take the data under the apples column in your Google Sheet. Notice that there is a default aggregation method attached to it already. Right now it is set to sum, but depending on what you need to show in your report, you can change this to whatever you like. So you can change the aggregation method from here, but also from within your report. So from here, meaning from the data source edit page. So if you don't know what to configure yet, no problem. We can always come in here and change that later. Calculated fields. Those are fields that you create by applying functions, operators, and branching logic to your data. The calculated field will appear as a metric in blue or as a dimension in green, depending on the output of your formula. For example, if I take the apples metric again, so as you know, this corresponds to the data under the apples column. So say I create a new field named apples and oranges. Let's go into the data sources, add a field. And I could name this apples and oranges. And here I would want to do apples plus oranges. Save this, close. So my formula was apples plus oranges, and the result that I wanted to create was the number of apples sold plus the number of oranges sold on that date. Now, would this calculated field be a metric or a dimension? Well, as discussed before, apples and oranges could be either a column header or it could also represent the data under it. So this means that we can use apples and oranges both as a dimension or a metric. Indeed, if we click on done and we go back to our report, we see that we now have a calculated field named apples and oranges. And I can drag it into dimensions. And I can also drag it into metrics. Let's now create another calculated field. Let's head back into our data source, add a field, and this time I'm going to create a field which is named apples and oranges text. Whoops. And here I'm just going to do the same. So I'm going to cast, oh no, I'm going to make it simple. So I'm just going to return some dummy text. So text. Click save, close, and then done to go back to the report. So back into the report, I now have an apples and oranges text calculated field, same as before. But now let's try to drag it into metrics. Well, we can't. There's an error now. So that was expected. So if I drag this into dimensions, let's add date again. It works. All right, so the last field type that we need to talk about is parameters. So parameters store user-defined data. So you can use parameters to customize your report and data sources depending on some user input. We'll see a real example later when we'll build a slider to control our data. So that's pretty much it. All right, so enough theories. Now let's go into practical lessons. In the next lecture, we'll learn how we can format tables so that we can start building our interactive dashboard.